Hi folks, this is David Birchall again with the second of two lecture pods for When Worlds Collide in Spring 2020. And we've called this week's topic Liberal Critics of Empire. As I mentioned in the first pod, divided this topic here into two issues and two individuals, so they're related individuals. The previous pod focused on Adam Smith and his criticisms of Britain's handling of its colonies in North America at the time of the American Revolution, or the outbreak of the American Revolution. In this pod, I'm going to focus more on Edmund Burke, famous 18th century Irish political writer and thinker and politician, and the question of Britain's developing colonies in India in the 18th century. That's Edmund Burke on the right hand side of the screen there. That's him speaking in Parliament at the time of the impeachment proceedings against the governor of the East India Company's governor in British India, Warren Hastings. He's looking all very impressive there, as you can see. He's probably wearing a wig. I spoke last week about the East India Company, this extraordinary monopoly trading company, which worked partly as a private trading company and partly in effect as an agency of the British state in the 17th and 18th centuries in India, and indeed into the middle of the 19th century there as well. And it spread its tentacles around the world, in fact. As I noted in the first lecture pod for this week, the East India Company was also involved in placing trade restrictions on the ability of the British colonists in North America to trade tea. As I mentioned in the second pod for last week's topic, despite its enormous economic and political successes in India in the 18th century, the East India Company had also built up a great many debts. One of the ways it had strengthened its importance and its role in Britain's Indian colonies was to be borrowing and lending money on a large scale, and particularly borrowing it. The company did not follow what we would call normal prudential standards of a private trading corporation nowadays. I think it thought it was too big to fail, as in certain respects it clearly was. And it happily carried on as if it had unlimited resources and could never die. And yet by the 1770s, the East India Company has hit various financial hurdles. It has borrowed more than it can afford to repay. It has been involved in the creation of a class of financial wizards in India to whom it owed a great deal of money, as well as also having lent money to people. And it was not able to manage its finances in relation to these debts in a way that we would consider responsible financial management nowadays. It built up debts of hundreds of thousands of English pounds in customs and duties to the British Crown as well, and was forced to borrow money from the British Crown in order to finance its debts. This was a particular problem for the East India Company because it had got through the 18th century more or less getting its own way with the British Crown and being largely benignly ignored by the British Parliament. But the House of Commons in London was never going to ignore being asked to subsidise the East India Company to the tune of tens of thousands of English pounds. So its chickens started coming home to roost. Likewise, when the East India Company reached out to attempt to manage to deal with its financial problems in India, it did so by putting new imposts and taxes on Indians in parts of India under British control. But this only further antagonised Indian people within British territories in India and exacerbated the crisis that the company faced, both in relation to its Indian dependence and the British Crown. So increasingly now, by the time that Burke enters the scene, the company is accountable to the British Parliament and being made to explain how it is that it's managed in a situation where it seemed that it could more or less print its own money to get itself into financial trouble. The key actor in the drama for this week, the second pod for this week, is the British governor for the East India Company in India, Warren Hastings. His historical reputation is complicated and controversial. He was born, as it said here, to a modest rural family. He did not come from a wealthy background. And he was sent to India in the first instance as a clerk in the Indian civil service. It was one of the striking features of the East India Company that it actually ran its own government bureaucracy in India and had its own effectively private civil service, whom it staffed out of the bright kids from the English school system, who were trained in England, outside London, and then sent to India to work in sort of administrative tasks in British India. So Hastings works his way up from the bottom, and he becomes appointed the first governor of Bengal in the early 1770s and held this post until 1785. He was regarded as a consummate diplomat and politician in Indian politics, playing off the local princes against one another, balancing local interests, always managing to come out on top. In a situation where, as I said last week, the British could not hope to rule India by sheer exercise of power or force. They had to do so by diplomacy, and in particular by setting local princes against one another. In later life, he drew and used a handsome salary, and he was also later, upon his return to Britain, I should say, and he was also treated upon his return to Britain as a founder of British Empire and as a sort of British hero in India. And some aspects of this reputation have survived to the modern day. In an era when cultural sensitivity is prized, he's often described by historians nowadays as exhibiting cultural sensitivity towards his Indian subjects. You can see bottom right-hand corner there. Warren Hastings being carried along on a litter in the Indian style, enjoying sort of Indian entertainment around him. I think this complicates the narrative of Warren Hastings' life. To Edmund Burke, Hastings was simply a rogue. To some modern historians, like contemporary Britons in the 18th century, he's a kind of perversely admirable figure because he seemed to enjoy trying to come to grips with Indian culture. And I suppose you have to decide in your own minds where you want to put the balance between his extortion of Britain's Indian subjects and his cultural sensitivity towards their lifestyle. Here's just a quick rundown of how Warren Hastings did out of India, I think to give us a sense of why it was that Edmund Burke and other critics in Britain were so angry with him. His salary as governor of the East India Company was 25,000 English pounds a year. Now, conversion rate between a pound and a dollar when Australia transferred to decimal currency back in the 1960s was about 2 to 1, which would make that 50,000 Australian dollars, but that's not really a remotely accurate representation in 18th century money. So a reference point would here be that second dot point there. £25 a year was the stipend of a poor rural clergyman in England, on which he and his family were supposed to get by as gentlefolk. £25,000 a year income could have kept the families of 1,000 English clergy in the manner of gentlemen. That's exactly how rich Warren Hastings was, a very rich man. However, his annual expenses in India were about 40,000 English pounds. Extraordinary money. Like so many rich people in the world then and now, the more he earned, the more he spent, and somehow he always seemed to find ways to spend more money than he earned. However, also at the same time, as you can see there, during his time in India as governor, he sent back to England for his own financial benefit 220,000 English pounds. A vast sum of money in 18th century terms. Later on, he's granted a public pension and also a loan by the British Crown of £50,000. So he's in the receipt of extraordinary amounts of money, the great bulk of which have come from Britain's Indian subjects. I think this is worthwhile keeping in mind when lauding him for his cultural sensitivity. Edmund Burke was a fiery and controversial figure in 18th century British life. He was born in Dublin to a modest family. He never forgot his Irish upbringing. Like Smith, he was always aware that he was, though he thought of himself as English in many ways, that he was not born English and that he came from the periphery of the British Isles. Ireland had been, at different times in its history, religiously persecuted by the British, economically exploited, and generally mistreated. Burke admired English public life, British public life, and became part of it, but he was always aware of the injustice that lay in the heart of the British Isles as a system. So in British Parliament, when he got elected, he was at first considered a radical figure on the left of British politics in the Whig Party, and he made a speciality out of reminding Britons of their founding principles and how often they were breaking them. This was clearly the entry point for him into the debates about the role of the East India Company in India. Here you had a company that was in effect wholly owned by the British Crown, although it was actually formally owned by its subscribers and shareholders, which was conducting business in India seemingly on behalf of the British Crown, but on principles that in Burke's mind and the minds of many others bore no relationship to British political principles. So first of all, in his career of commenting on British politics abroad, Burke was critical of the British Crown in relation to the American colonies and actively sympathised with the American colonists in their revolt against Britain in 1776 and afterwards. But then later on, he was also appalled by the revolution in France, which seemed to him to overthrow France's national traditions in the interests of claims about liberty that Burke frankly mistrusted as not being true. That shift between his sympathy for the American revolutions and his bitter criticisms of the French revolutionaries lost him many friends, and it's the reason why nowadays we think of Burke as a conservative, even though he would have been quite annoyed by this description himself. So Smith and Burke were similar in certain respects. They were both critical of the British Empire. They were both insistent that Britain should maintain its political principles as broad as well as at home, but they were also different. Smith's criticisms had their foundations in economics, Burke's in morality and politics. He specialised in accusing people of hypocrisy, of saying one thing and doing another, and in Warren Hastings he found his perfect target. After Hastings returned from India, questions were mounted, not very surprisingly, about his expenditure and misuse of his powers, and how it was that someone who became so wealthy out of India simultaneously could have led to the East India Company appearing to become so poor. So, using proceedings which we're familiar with more recently used against the President of the United States, Burke used the tradition in the British Constitution of allowing the impeachment of high public officials to lead a series of attacks against Warren Hastings in the House of Commons, where he, Burke, made some impassioned and, by the way, very long speeches attacking Hastings for his excesses. And you can see there, that's what's happening there. There's Edmund Burke, bottom right-hand corner, dressed like an Indian, hoisting Warren Hastings from his own petard while Hastings is being strangled by all the money that he's stolen from India, which is now tied around his feet like lead weights. The key point of Burke's attacks on Hastings was that Hastings had behaved like an arbitrary ruler. He had treated India as if it was simply plunder to be used by the British Crown and the East India Company for its own benefit or for their own benefit, whereas actually Burke claimed the people of India were the subjects of the British Crown to the extent that they were being ruled by the East India Company. And so the money that Hastings and others had extracted out of India and taken home with them to Britain, according to Burke in his criticism of Hastings, was not their money at all, but money that they had stolen from the Indian nation. And the implication of Burke's attacks on Hastings is quite clear, that Hastings should have been behaving as a British ruler in India would have behaved towards British subjects, that the Indian subjects should be thought of as if they were British subjects, while they were being ruled even at arm's length by the British Crown. As Jennifer Pitts points out in her reading up on views for this week, Burke's attack on Hastings, while it was definitely an attack on Hastings personally, and Burke loved this stuff, he loved to attack people. You can see some others of his attacks on the right-hand side of the screen there, images of later attacks of his on radicals in Britain. Nevertheless, ultimately, Burke's attacks, while they were personalised against Hastings, were against the East India Company and the way that it ruled India, taking Hastings simply to be the highest representative of the East India Company and therefore also the highest representative of British rule in India. In a sense, Burke's attacks on Hastings parallel his attacks on George III and his management of Britain's colonies in North America. So Burke is treating the East India Company not as a private trading company pursuing financial interests, but as representatives of the British Crown, bound by its charter with the British Crown to behave in the interests of all Britons, and also by implication Britain's Indian subjects. And so Burke also treats British rule in India similarly to the way he had reacted against British rule over its North American colonies, that the British in India had oppressed British subjects there, Britain's Indian subjects, by taking money from them without granting them representation or recourse, so that they could have a say in how the money was spent. Ultimately, Edmund Burke offers the British Crown two choices. Either they can take charge of Britain's Indian subjects as British subjects and accord them the same rights as Britons at home, or else they should leave India altogether and leave India to the Indians. It sounds to us like a very radical charge, and we're even surprised that Britons, even Irish Britons in the 18th century, would talk this way. But there was a significant body of support for Burke's point of view, even though the East India Company held the financial interests of a great many prominent Britons. And Burke insists that the alternative to these courses of action is to destroy the reputation of British justice in the face of the world. Now, as we know with the benefit of hindsight, Burke's advice was not followed. While the East India Company was reformed and its practices had to be altered, it remained in control of Britain's colonies in India up until the middle of the 19th century, when the British Crown finally took control after the rebellion of 1857. Nevertheless, Burke, in his attacks upon the role of the company in India, gave other critics in Britain ammunition with which to work, and also, to some extent, critics in India itself, giving them arguments to direct against the British Crown. And so he became, in a sense, the first of a number of British critics against British rule in India, who to some extent were making common cause, even if only rhetorically, with Indian people themselves, therefore forging this kind of curious relationship that we've seen much, much later on in the 20th century, when some British citizens, radicals and others, actively sympathised with the Indians against their British rulers. That's enough for this second lecture pod. Enjoy the readings and good luck in tutorials this week. Take care, everybody.